Hello, I'm Doug Musio. This is CityTalk. Ill-conceived, ineffective, unnecessary, ironic? Those words are the description by the Fiscal Policy Institute of Governor Cuomo's 2014-15 budget presentation. Ouch! To talk New York State budget, to talk taxes and spending, is James Parrott, chief economist and deputy director at the Fiscal Policy Institute. The Institute deals with economic, fiscal, and budgetary policy issues and works to create understanding of New York State's tax system and the adequacy of state and local public services. Welcome back.
Thank you, Doug.
It's a real pleasure. Let's start with FPI's response to the Cuomo budget. And I'm reading directly from the press release. The Institute calls various tax proposals ill-conceived, ineffective, unnecessary, or ironic. Lay out the, if you will, the indictment.
Okay. Well, if we could start with the overall budget
and
what it achieves. You know, it's important to keep in mind that we've been in recovery mode at the national economy in New York State for, this is going on the 5th year.
Right.
But this is the weakest recovery we've had since the Great Depression.
And weakest in what sense?
Weakest in the sense of employment growth and overall growth in the economy, GDP growth, if you will. Now, one of the reasons why we've had such weak growth is that we've had declines in government spending, both at the federal level since 2009 and at the state and local level.
Right.
And we see that in New York. So we've basically had state budgets that have been austerity budgets. The austerity budget started in 2009 through the current year, ending March 31st.
2009, so that's really the Patterson administration.
Right. When you know, the recession really started in 2008, so 2009 was the first austerity budget. So we've had 6 years of austerity budgets. The governor's budget proposal, beginning with 2014-15, the fiscal year beginning April 1st this year, running to May 31st, to March 31st of 2015, and the next 3 years are a continuation of austerity budgeting, with spending growing 2%, less than the projected rate of inflation. That will give us another 4 years of austerity. 6 plus 4 is 10 years, a decade of austerity. It's no wonder we have weak economic recovery and high unemployment.
What specifically do you mean by austerity?
Austerity is when we have, compelling public needs in many areas, in K through 12 education, in public higher education, in infrastructure, in social services, in the safety net, in public health, in all of the areas that the state budget carries a lot of the weight in New York State. We've had growth on average that's been less than 2% for the last 3 years. And the projection is that even as the economy is recovering, we have income growth projected to grow 4, 5, 5.5% a year. And yet the governor's proposing to keep the growth in spending so low that, you know, New York State is still far behind in terms of funding the aid that it provides to school districts in New York City and all around the state. We're $5 billion below where we should be if the state were to honor the legislation passed in 2007 to to address the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit that dates back to the early 1990s.
And that gets to, in a sense, sort of the sideshow, if you will, of the conflict between Mayor de Blasio and Governor
Right.
Cuomo of universal pre-K, I remember the mayor sort of doubling or tripling down, said, well, if the governor's got all this money and he wants to put it in, how about
Right.
funding the CFE, which was really, I mean, sort of talking about this political battle moving beyond the policy. I mean, this is very significant here. Is there any possibility at all that the city could get a piece of the CFE decision money?
Well, it's getting a little bit, but we're still far behind where we should be. So the state overall is $5 billion behind where it should be. New York City's share of that is $2 billion. So
that's real money.
We're
talking real money.
Given that we have a school budget in New York City of about $22 billion, $2 billion is
There's a lot of money. That's 10%.
It's a significant, and on the pre-K commitment, New York State has had a commitment to fund universal pre-K since the late 1990s. It just hasn't honored that commitment, just the same as with the resolving the CFE case. So it's no wonder
you just ignore it.
It's no wonder that the mayor is seeking dedicated funding at a level to adequately fund universal pre-K in New York City. The governor's proposal is to phase in a total amount of spending statewide, $500 million. All observers who look at that see that as inadequate to the task of really doing quality universal pre-K, truly universal full-day pre-K statewide. So we need to do that. So getting back to the criticism of the tax policy, so the governor says that we're projecting a budget surplus, so we have room to cut taxes.
Would you explain all this too? I'm confused. Every time you come here, I'm confused. Explain this to
if
me.
you look at the budget projections, they call for gaps of $1 billion, $2 billion, $2.5 billion for fiscal 2014-15 and for the next 3 years.
It's
so we're projecting
if you will.
gaps. So the governor is saying, okay, his budget proposal is calling for limiting spending growth to 2%. And that entails lots of cuts. With those cuts, we can close those gaps. But in addition to that, we're going to have a second round of cuts that we don't know exactly how those are going to play out because those are unspecified cuts. Now, the total dollar amount over the next 3 years of those spending cuts, those unspecified spending cuts, is $6 to $7 billion. So another round of cuts. So with his 2 rounds of cuts, lo and behold, there's a surplus because we've cut spending so much that given projected revenue growth, there's a surplus. And then he takes every dollar of surplus and uses that to cut taxes. And he's got, something for everyone except the poor and the middle class, really, in those tax cuts. He's got a property tax freeze, he's got a circuit breaker, he's got a renter's credit, he's got business and bank tax reductions, and the one that I find particularly ironic, given that New York State has the most polarized income distribution of any
which
state
is
in the
another
country.
Fiscal Policy Institute study, by the way.
Right. So with that, he's proposing to cut the estate tax, which otherwise, in the absence of that proposed cut, would be the fastest growing revenue source in New York. It would grow from $1 billion to $2 billion over the next 5 years. It's growing so rapidly precisely because of income concentration. Nationally, 95% of the income growth in this recovery in the last 3 or 4 years has gone to the top 1%. 95%. The picture is basically pretty similar in New York. So it's not surprising that the estate tax is projected to increase its revenue. So the governor says, well, wait a minute, I'm going to cut that. I'm going to cut that in a way that mainly benefits not just the top 1%, but the 1% of the 1%, the very wealthiest households. So I call that's an ironic tax code.
Okay, what is the administration, the governor's policy rationale for these cuts, if you will, or continuations of non-payment?
Well,
what's the policy rationale?
He says that New York State has a spending problem, and he presented data. He framed his budget presentation, back about a month ago, now by saying that New York State has a spending problem. He looks back over the last 50 years, from the early 60s to 2012,
Right.
and says that state spending has been growing faster than income. So we decided to, analyze that a little bit and look at what the picture really showed. And over that 50-year period, it sort of shows that.
Right.
But
that's why you picked 50 years. Go ahead.
Aggregate that.
Right.
You see that the entire period when spending or taxes grew faster than income occurred between the early 60s and the mid 70s. That was the period when Medicaid was instituted in 1964, when SUNY and CUNY were expanded dramatically.
Right.
So state spending increased a lot up till 1975. Over the last 35 years, personal income in New York State has actually grown faster than state taxes or state spending. The exact opposite of what the governor said.
Well, it depends what denominator you use.
Well, or what time period you would,
That's exactly right.
So we would say, looking at over the last 35 years, income has grown faster than state taxes. And that doesn't even allow for the fact that the personal income concept doesn't include capital gains, which are a big item in New York State. That's the gains that people realize from holding stock that appreciates in value, from real estate that appreciates in value. They sell it for more than what they bought it for, and so on. Capital gains is a big factor. That's grown a lot. And it also doesn't count the incomes of high-income New Jersey and Connecticut residents who work in New York City and take those incomes back to those states.
Well, I'm not that high, but I do that. I'm one of those people. Go ahead.
So anyway, if we had a more accurate specification of personal income, it would be growing much faster than state spending in New York State. So all of that's by way of saying that we need to keep in perspective the growth in the state economy. And we would argue that when the state has so many compelling needs in terms of providing, it has a constitutional mandate as interpreted by the courts to provide a sound basic education, K through 12. The state, the governor, and the mayor of New York City both want to, and as well as a lot of local officials, want to extend that back to pre-K and into the 0 to 3 year range as well. So all of that, those are sound public investments, but we're not investing enough at this point to really honor that commitment.
And then what would be the source of capital for this investment?
Well, it would be the state tax base. A tax base that has been that hasn't grown as fast as the economy has.
And when you say state tax base, what specific taxes are we talking about, or what admixture of taxes?
Right. So the main source of state tax revenues is the personal income tax. We also have business income taxes. We have a corporate tax and a bank tax. And actually, one of our criticisms of the governor's corporate tax reform proposal is that it's unnecessary because the business income tax share of total state taxes has been declining like this. It's gone from 16% of total state taxes in the 1980s through 1995, basically. And now it's down to 10%. With the additional business tax cuts and the repeal of the bank tax that the governor's proposing, that share will go down further to 8%. So we're not really collecting enough from business taxes because we've added lots of loopholes. We have lots of business tax credits. I served on the Solomon McCall Tax Commission.
And we're going to talk about
that. All of the people on that commission, the 10 or 12 of us, were very concerned about the sort of Wild West growth in business tax credits in New York State that have tripled in value from 2005 to 2013, gone from $600 million to $1.8 billion. A lot of that is growth in refundable tax credits, where the state is actually writing checks to companies. So not only has the tax liability gone down, but we're actually refunding, increasingly refunding payments. So the state writes more than $1 billion.
Okay, I have to ask the question, how effective are these? I mean, is there any evaluation or assessment on economic impacts, whether it's employment or multiplier effects on local or regional economies? I mean, do we ever assess the impact of these tax incentives?
When economists, as opposed to, say, politicians,
What an interesting contrast.
look at economic development policies and business tax breaks and so on, you know, they usually conclude that the business tax breaks are not effective, that what companies really base their location decisions on is a quality workforce, a high quality of living, good public education, good infrastructure, all the things that require, government spending and investments, infrastructure investments, investments in education, K through 12, 0 through 3, pre-K, higher education, and so on. That's what would really make New York competitive and stand out vis-a-vis other states. And we're just not investing enough in that area. So these studies and the Solomon Commission commissioned a study by two economists to look at this. And They reviewed the literature and they analyzed the New York State business tax credits and concluded that we're not really getting fair value for what our investment has been, and that we should not only stop adding more tax breaks on, new tax breaks were added last year, but we should rein in some of the ones that we have.
So this report is released in November 2013. You just described some of the recommendations and conclusions, and what happened?
Well, the governor appointed a second tax commission, the Pataki-McCall Tax Commission, the Tax Cut Commission.
So
ours was the tax reform.
Okay. So you don't like one report, you do another one?
And we had a mandate to come up with revenue neutral recommendations so that if we were proposing changes that would reduce taxes, we needed to offset that with other proposals that would raise taxes. That would, for example, close loopholes, reduce our spending on business tax breaks and so on. And that's what we did.
So we didn't do this. So we went to the McCall-Pataki, and what did they recommend?
Well, so they recommended property tax relief in the form of a property tax freeze and a circuit breaker proposal. Circuit breaker proposal that uses the income tax to provide property tax relief based on somebody's property tax burden. That is, the amount of property taxes they pay relative to their income. Now, if that's done...
Wait a minute, to explain circuit breaker, though. What do you mean circuit breaker
Circuit breaker, think of it in terms of a circuit breaker in your house. A circuit breaker flips when the circuit gets too hot to prevent something from overheating or overloading.
I get it.
So a circuit breaker on the income tax is a way to prevent a property tax burden from getting so high that it pushes somebody out of their house. So that's the theory behind it.
Okay.
A lot of it depends on how you structure that. So you get relief, you get a break on your income tax in order to bring down your property tax burden, the amount of property taxes you pay relative to your income. So you want to target that to people who have really high property tax burdens relative to their incomes. Either their incomes are low
it sounds
or
rational.
their property taxes are really high relative to their incomes. But that's not exactly what the Pataki-McCall Commission recommended, and that's certainly not what the governor is proposing. He's proposing sort of an across-the-board approach to circuit breaker, which provides a little bit of relief to a lot of people, basically whether or not they really are experiencing high property tax burdens.
Okay, so
and, that's a popular approach in Albany. Give everybody a little bit of money. In fact, last year, they passed the family tax credit, where people will get a check in the mail in October.
And elections are in what month? November?
November.
Okay, good. Explain.
I guess that's right before the election.
Right.
So they already did that. So the governor is coming along and saying, in order to make sure that taxpayers, voters got the message, we're going to cut more taxes, whether or not we can afford it. And the cost of that tax cut package is a decade of austerity and underinvestment in the things that are really important in New York.
Okay, now we've been talking on the plane of policy. Let's talk about the plane of politics. And clearly, my assumption here is that politics is driving this and conflicts with your policy rationality. If all of these things have these adverse consequences or neutral consequences rather than positive consequences. Why? Why the governor doing it, and what's the rationale?
Well, again, we started off talking about how this is a weak recovery. People haven't seen a significant increase in their incomes adjusted for inflation and so on. So people are, like to see tax cuts, like to see some money
and
coming back
particularly targeted to them directly.
Right. So that's happening to some extent, although in the scheme of things, you look at the total dollar amount of the tax cut, a big chunk of it is going to repealing the bank tax and to cutting corporate taxes, cutting the rate on the corporate taxes, and the estate tax change to basically reduce that by $800 million over the next 5 years. So a lot of that goes to the very richest people.
God, let me just, what's the policy rationale? What's the stated rationale for this package of cuts?
Well, so it's that New York State has an unsustainable tax burden.
Right.
We have a high tax burden. There's no way to sugarcoat that. It's high. I don't know that it's the highest in the country, but it's not high relative to the size and profitability of our economy. And given our needs, particularly in the education area and in the infrastructure area, I don't know that we have too much government or too much spending. We could have a stronger economy and stronger economic growth and more balanced growth if we had a better distribution of school aid, and if we hadn't been disinvesting in public higher education as we have in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, that's a particular bugaboo of mine, and being an employee of CUNY, but certainly SUNY has really had a massive hit in terms of their real-term dollars since, 2008?
Since the recession started,
right?
There's been for SUNY anyway, there's been a 40% reduction in real terms. We haven't seen any increase in the tuition assistance program that New York State has to help loan.
Another thing we're really interested in.
The cap on that has been at $5,000. It's been that way for over a decade.
Yeah.
There's a proposal this year to increase that to $6,500.
Yeah.
If you
it's still
if you kept it at what the constant dollar value adjusted for inflation, it would be more like $8,500 rather than $5,000.
Yeah, that makes sense without doing the math. But isn't the argument that if taxes, we're an overtaxed state, and that if we don't do something about taxes, residents and businesses will leave.
Right.
Now, you've argued that the business's decisional calculus, the taxes are relatively low on the list of considerations in the calculus.
Right.
And individuals, are there studies, rigorous analyses that either suggest one thing or the other, or are they all mixed?
Well, you have to look at the mix of state and local taxes in New York. We have, in the suburbs and upstate, property taxes are very high. They're some of the highest property taxes relative to housing values.
Yep.
And that's because when New York State's tax burden is compared to other states, we're not a high tax state. But when you put the state and local tax burden together, we are high tax. And we've been arguing for a long time that we need to reconfigure the state-local fiscal relationship, rely more on a progressive, broad-based state personal income tax, and use that to reduce property taxes at the local level through a real circuit breaker approach or something like that. So that would give us a more equitable tax structure. The top quintile in the income distribution, the top 20% of people, pay a lower share of their income in taxes than people at the middle or at the bottom in New York State. So we have a tax burden problem in the sense that it's regressive overall. Property taxes and sales taxes are regressive. The personal income tax is progressive. We think that there's room to make it more progressive. Sure. When you add them all together, on balance, New York State has a regressive tax system. High-income people are paying less than low and middle-income people are paying. So through tax reform, we could reconfigure that, provide tax relief to most New Yorkers, and ask the people at the very top to pay a little bit more. Now, it's interesting.
Wait a minute, stop. At the state level?
At the state level.
Is that going to, let's talk political realities here. Come on.
Before we talk political, so let's talk economic reality.
Okay, go ahead.
So people say that you can't raise taxes at the top because high-income people are very mobile and they will leave.
I don't believe, but go ahead.
So look at the numbers. What the numbers show is that New York State's share of households with incomes of $1 million or more has grown since 2000. Our population hasn't grown that much. It hasn't grown relative. Our share of population has declined. Our share of millionaires has grown. The total incomes of our millionaires has grown almost 3 times as fast as the incomes of millionaires nationally. So that's a picture that if some rich people are leaving, then even richer people must be taking their place in greater numbers.
And it seems as if I saw a study in New Jersey that seemed to suggest a similar finding, that not only did it not deter, but it seemed to have had either no impact or other things led to an increase. Okay, now, New York City, New York State. The mayor and the governor are at odds on this universal pre-K funding. Talk about, in a sense, the visions of the mayor and the governor and how that's translated into the real world of tax policy. And you've got a minute and a half to do it.
Well, to the mayor's credit, he really took the lead in this area, and that was a centerpiece of his campaign. He's going to establish universal pre-K in New York City and pay for it with a dedicated funding stream, a tax on high-income people.
Right.
That was very popular. He won the primary by such a margin he didn't even have to go through a runoff.
Right.
And he won the general election with a huge margin.
Right.
So the governor sees that and says, okay, I also support universal pre-K and so on. But the problem is that the governor is not really putting enough money on the table to pay for that. Secondly, his austerity budget makes you wonder, how is he really going to pay for even the modest amount that he is suggesting he's going to commit to this area? So the mayor, I think, is on the more solid ground. Both of them support the concept, which is great.
Right.
So that's real progress.
Right.
But the mayor is right in saying that we need a dedicated funding stream that will adequately finance this over the next few years. And you know what? That will increase the tax burden on the top 1% in New York, but their share of New York City local taxes will still be less than their share of income.
Okay, last question. Yes, so is this going to happen? Are we going to get a home rule through the legislature and the governor to tax
Well, I don't have a crystal ball.
Well,
but
go ahead.
I would say, there are some people upstate who say that, well, if New York City wants to pay for its own pre-K, that will leave more resources for the rest of the state, and the governor's not really putting enough money on the table in the first place.
Well,
so
I'm not hearing this stuff.
I wouldn't say that it's out of the question.
Okay. So we're going to end on that semi-optimistic note for this conversation?
Well, I could be more optimistic if you like.
No, that was perfectly fine. My thanks to James Parrott for being on the show and for preparing us for this year's fiscal and economic issues here on CUNY TV. Excellent. Thank you.
Good.
Hello, I'm Doug Musio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at cuny.tv. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.